wants to kick us off with it? Going over to Amy, or?
I'll start. I'm going to run the slideshow tonight. So we're excited, based on our last conversation around Chapter 103 and where we've been with seclusion and restraint, to share with you some of the great work that's been happening over the last several years around social, emotional, and behavioral health supports, and even how that was further highlighted this year through that work group that we pulled together last year, those 11 meetings that each month you get an update from. So I'm going to take you a little bit through the first slides. We've got several people around the table tonight that as we move into that part of the slideshow, I would just ask those individuals to either introduce themselves, or maybe the person that's helping to lead the previous section of slides can introduce them. So with that, we'll get started here. So we're going to really take the presentation in two parts. The first part will be the reference into the publication. I sent that out to all of you ahead of time because I thought it was important for you to see how the work was all intersecting. And we're going to start with the presentation to talk about those supports that are offered to all students. And then as we move through the presentation, you're going to hear about interventions that happen at the gen ed level, as well as interventions that we can offer to our students that are entitled in special education, and then how we really move into supporting students with intense needs. So kind of more of a general education flavor to begin with, and then as we move into more information around our entitled students. So in that big publication, one of the important things that we did was put together the SEBH framework, kind of as a one-stop shop. And we talked to all of you a lot about our multi-tiered system of supports. And we talk about that both on the academic side, how we support students, as well as on the social, emotional, behavioral health side. And although the work has been ongoing and really good over the last couple of years, we didn't have a landing spot or a landing page for that. So that framework that you'll see really narrated out on pages 6 through 16 is our description of what our multi-tiered system of supports looks like across our attendance centers. When we think about that, we often share with you that triangle of Tier 1 supports for all students, and then fewer students maybe need some additional interventions, and maybe we're talking roughly 15 to 20% of our students there, and then maybe from there even those supports are enough, and so we think about amping it up even more. For roughly anywhere from 0 to 5% of our students, we continue to meld those supports and provide a different level of intensity for students. We like to think about using the 4 PLC questions. So PLC stands for the Professional Learning Communities. And we think that those 4 PLC questions really also help paint the work of a strong multi-tiered system of support. So that's a strong triangle that we talk about. So through that, there are these 4 PLC questions that we like to ask ourselves, both on the academic side as well as the social, emotional, behavioral health side. We want all students to be able to do. How do we know if they're learning it, demonstrating proficiency or competency? How are we going to respond when some students do not learn it or demonstrate proficiency? And then how do we extend the learning? So if you think about that, this is typically on the academic side, standards. When you're going to hear a little bit in the presentation that this is really around social emotional learning competencies when we talk about the social emotional behavioral health. How do we know if they've learned it and demonstrate proficiency? On the academic side, those are all the reading, the math assessments, the grading that we're monitoring. On this side, you're going to hear from Lindsay Green in a minute about the different sorts of instruments that we look at and monitor to understand how well our students are doing. And then third question, we'll get at interventions. How do we respond? How do we help our students get to a different place? And then how can we extend that? So tonight, Laura Daly couldn't be with us, but we have 2 members from the Learning Supports Department with us, Kareem Frank, and you've seen Kareem at the board table before. She's the coordinator of our Learning Supports Department, and Lindsay Schluckbier, she is our counseling curriculum coordinator. So they're here to help out with bits and pieces of the presentation. And while they hit on some big highlights around these 4 PLC questions, I'm going to display the publication. Roll through it, the table of contents, and just remind everybody that we're really talking about this component of the publication, again on page 6. And there's a nice graphic. It's a kind of our anchor page, and we talked about having kind of a plan on a page. So there's a lot of information when you talk about a multi-tiered system of supports. And it was This particular document here is built out, and it's actually linked in the publication, more for our staff to have access to, because although we narrated it over 10 pages, there's a lot of meat to it, and this particular document is even lengthier for our staff. I'm not doing a good job with the display. It's kind of tiny there, but the 4 PLC questions are here, and I think Corinne's going to take the first one.
Sure. So good to see everybody. Thanks for having us. Laura, yes, led the work for our department to start kind of pulling this all together and having it, like Amy said, in a way that was easy to view and access and start to really work from. And I also think it's important to let you guys know Allison Freitag worked really hard on the actual publication, and she's not here either. And that was like a dissertation project, so it's really important that she gets acknowledgement for that hard work. So question 1, centering the SEBH work with the PLC questions was a really nice way to help all of us understand and remember that this is just an extension of academics, right? Our teaching staff are familiar with these questions. They're used to using them in a way that we look at and figure out how kids are doing at school. So using the PLC questions to guide this work was a really nice way to kind of bridge that learning for everyone. We've always had the PBIS component. We've been working really hard over the last couple of years to really build that up. So there's a layer of expectation and understanding of what kids are expected, what adults are expected to do, and how our schools kind of run. And what Amy mentioned with the SEL competencies has really helped us extend this to be a much deeper, well-rounded kind of tier of universal for everybody, right? So the competencies, which Amy, you want to pull up that where it shows the bands, yeah. So the state has laid out for us the SEL competencies, so the social emotional learning competencies by grade level band, which gives us something to look back to really start to look at progress that our kids are making and what we're aiming for. So that's been something we've leaned hard on and will continue to use as we build out our universal or our core, what we want all kids to know, kind of that first question. The overall goal really to teach SEL both explicitly and implicitly, so it's really, they know what they're getting, kids understand it, parents understand it, teachers understand it, and it's also embedded throughout the course of the day. So it is really woven into everything that we're doing. That's the ultimate goal. It supports that whole child approach and really gives us a solid tenet to work from, right? So we get our kids prepared with those 21st century skills. So we're excited to have this from the state, partnering with the work that we were already doing to really raise up and extend PBIS, and it feels like a nice way to start pushing us even further forward to make sure that our kids have that social emotional learning and some really good ways to look at that across the board. So that's the starting place, right? That's laying out what we want the kids to know. So I'm going to let Lindsay talk about the second question.
Yeah, so the second question is, how will we know if they've learned it, right? That they're able to do it and that they've demonstrated proficiency. And what is really nice about the social emotional learning competencies and really digging into this work and thinking about social emotional behavioral health across our systems, and not just I speak from a counseling perspective because I was a counselor, and now as a curriculum coordinator for the counselors, it's not just the counselors going into the classrooms, the elementary level once a week, and then that's your social emotional behavioral health done, and then, oh, they got it, and we don't even need anything at the secondary level, right? So, or thinking just, now we're just going to pop into tier three, like refer out. So we're really looking at it comprehensively and embedded throughout the day, and with that, being very intentional about our decisions being data-driven, and there really are a lot of data points available to us with social emotional behavioral health. And so when we were working on the publication, we actually had time with the different levels and the different leaders in the levels and had them look at these PLC questions and think through, what does this look like in your building in the areas of social emotional behavioral health? And one of those was this question too, and what data sources are available that we're looking at regularly or need to be looking at. So we have just a convergence of multiple data sources. We have obviously office discipline referrals. That's been the big one for years, right? And we want to get beyond that. We know that that's not the only marker of social emotional behavioral health. We look at attendance. We now have these screeners and are building up screeners K-12 that we're going to look at 3 times a year. And we look at academic performance, of course. We also are really trying to figure out how to quantify out of class time, as we know that that can indicate proficiency or need for support. So things like a lot of time in the counselor's office, a lot of time in the health office, visiting the student and family advocate, just not being in class. So really trying to figure out how to quantify that, like I said. And then positive acknowledgments. How are we noticing those kids who are getting a lot of positive acknowledgments because they're really demonstrating that they are doing really well with those social emotional learning competencies. So now I kind of referenced this, but we're going to go into that third question about how will we respond if they haven't learned it, those interventions. So Kareen's going to talk about that.
So one thing I'll just say before you go on to that part, Kareen, so if you kind of think about it like social emotional learning, well, part of the challenge the district had to face first is how do we get a core, piece of curriculum and instruction around this, right? Because it was kind of a new thing that was brought in for us to consider and teach in an intentional way. So the first thing you have to develop is a core, right? And that's what Kareen talked about with that first question. Then Lindsay's explaining to you is, okay, well, how do we know if they're getting core, right? If that core is even working before we get to all the way to the intervention. I thought she did a nice job of showing, well, first we have to have an idea of what the heck we want them to know so that we don't just jump them to like some type of a pull-out extreme intervention. And so trying to build that progression is part of the work in front of us when we think about teaching our kids those social emotional learning skills or behavior health components. So
yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say thanks for mentioning that, Matt, because one thing I did forget, I neglected to say, was we also really want to make sure that the social emotional learning instruction that's delivered to our students is research-based, right, and is taught with fidelity. And so that's really important. We don't just, we don't want to just put whatever out there. So we're really being intentional about making sure that we're giving professional development to our teachers in morning meetings and homeroom advisories where some of that learning takes place, making sure the materials that they have access to are research-based.
Thank you. And you guys have heard me mention in the last 12 months that the official inclusion of the morning meeting happened last year for the first time at the elementary level. So some of these things that we're talking to tonight are still pretty much in the infancy stage. And having a set-aside designated time at the elementary level had been happening in some of our buildings, but again, a standardized practice last year. The other piece, and that would have been related to what Kareen was saying, because we have to have time and opportunity then to do this work. And so that was, again, official at the elementary level. I would say that we've got farther to go, but definitely some time set aside at the secondary level with that homeroom and advisory time. And then as far as Lindsay's component, the other piece that I would just share with you that is in its infancy stage is that My Saver screener that we used for the first time with our K-8 students in the winter and in the spring. It's just, last year for the first time. We are also as part of the next steps in the publication that we talked about, a series of next steps, had looked at and been trying to find a 9-12 screener, and we will have that through Panorama for next year for our high school kids, so that's exciting as well. All right, so all kids.
Okay, so if they haven't learned it, right, that's the next step. And I think Matt set it up well to say we really are just starting to get solid core, right? We've done a lot of things over the years and taught a lot of different pieces of this, but we're coming back to a refocus on what we think that core should be and what it needs to be and how do we move kids through that. So there's a handful of things I'll mention in here. I think this piece and the next piece, there's a lot to go, right? There's a lot of good work being done, but a lot of work to come. So the intervention piece, what if they haven't learned it, right? So the first thing is really just continuing to enhance that core for everybody. So reteaching, pre-teaching, modeling, practicing, all those things that go into just good instructional practice, really focusing on that as a big tool that we use. The morning meetings that have been mentioned, the homeroom advisory, having time to really teach those lessons explicitly, reteach if needed, give some additional instruction opportunities to kids as those come up. And then we move into what might be some targeted or intensive instructional opportunities, some groups, some individual time, other ways that kids can access or get additional support. Right now, most of our buildings have individually decided what those criteria are for kids to kind of move through the system, and that's something else as a team we're focusing on, right? How do we allow for a little bit of consistency and some wiggle room? Because we know that needs to occur, but the hard the hard pieces that need to be in place, and where do our buildings have some individual time.
Can you give a concrete example of that, how it might differ between buildings?
Sure.
Check-in, check-out?
Yep. So right now, a really basic one that we've used for a long time is like a check-in, check-out, right? Where a kid gets a little additional extra support throughout the day. And buildings may decide that when a student has 3 office referrals, that's an intervention they'd like to look at to really work on those relationship building skills. Another building may say it's 5 office referrals, right? It's a silly thing, but it also starts to have some differentiation across the buildings, which is harder for all of us than to support and keep everybody moving in the same direction. So revisiting that and having buildings come together and decide what do we as a large team believe are the right kind of indicators to move through some of these. Is that?
Yes. Before you go to PLC question 4, where you kind of differentiate between what a tier 2 or a tier 3 intervention looks like versus in the way of support.
Yep, sure. So for the most part, tier 2 are going to be easy, quick, kind of a group-based intervention, right? Something you can get in place quickly, something that's easy to implement, something that a lot of kids, like Amy said, maybe that 15 to 20% of kids are accessing. And then the tier 3 is going to be much more individualized. So it could be that we're reteaching a small group a lesson that was covered in counseling, but then we're pulling another student to do some really one-on-one work because they need to practice the skill a lot more intently to be able to access it and do it well. So it goes from kind of a small group to more individualized. So as you build up, right, it's almost like whole class, small group, individual. It's not quite that simple, but that's a nice visual that kind of aligns with the way the triangle is set up.
And our tier 3 plans can include functional behavioral assessment.
Yep, all kinds of stuff, right? And we'll get into this more even because we can, all of our kids sit within this triangle, and that's a really important piece to remember. So we have the typical things you've heard about probably before through PBIS within this, both tier 2 and tier 3, check and check out, SAGE groups for small group instruction, the check and connect, the FBA or the functional behavioral assessment and the BIP process, the behavioral intervention plan. We also look at our partner providers, right? So the individuals that help and do some school-based therapy, the DBT, dialectical behavioral training groups we've been doing at some of our high school sites, Brandy and I have been able to work on. So there's a number of things that would fall into this kind of intervention-based, what do we do for kids when they're not getting core instruction as much as we would like them to.
I think the thing that connects the dots always for me on it, the thing that we have to keep working on that I'll probably beat the drum on again here is we got to a tipping point where we were doing all of those interventions for a lot of kids, right? And that means that, again, core doesn't work, right? When we get to a point where we're doing too many interventions with too many students, that means we don't have a solid core and more kids needed a solid core. So Amy used that term infancy a couple times. I think that's something also that we should be a little bit proud of about being on the front end of these conversations, because that's what the state's having the conversation around. They pulled up the DE website just showing the state released that while we're working on it, right? And so that's part of the road we're traveling along this. The interventions, like Corrine listed off, are going to sound more familiar because that's what we've been trying to do. But now we've reached a point where so many students need it that core has to be a large component of it. And so that's why you might have greater familiarity with some of the interventions than actually what we talked about on the front end.
Yes, that fourth PLC question of what if they demonstrate proficiency? How do we enhance the learning? How do we enrich that learning? And that one's a little trickier with social emotional behavioral health. It doesn't fit as neatly as maybe the academics do with we would provide them extension activities, or they might qualify for ELP or honors classes, whatever. It doesn't look the same with social emotional behavioral health. And also we're just really new to really working on that solid core. However, there are pieces like lots of positive acknowledgments, right? We might be giving them extra positive acknowledgments. There's lots of opportunities, student leadership opportunities, K-12 for students to engage in, and it often is those kids who've demonstrated proficiency in social emotional learning competencies. And we really want our buildings to be looking at their systems on a regular basis. And if it seems like the kids have really mastered these, a competency, there's always opportunities to layer and to enhance that learning building wide. And so we would want them to always be doing that.
Thank you. And so the thing we want to share with you next is just a quick little look at the action plan. So as we think about our building CSIP plans, we always have goals around behavior and climate and culture. And one way we have them tracking this is through their PBIS action plans. And I was going to have Lindsay speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is we need to give another shout out to Allison Freitag because she works with the building so closely on getting these action plans, helping them work through these action plans and getting them turned in, and she's highlighted these here. So all of our buildings, at the end of the year, they look at some data related to social, emotional, behavioral health from that building perspective, and they submit these action plans. And this year, they had a list of priorities that they could choose from based on professional development and the focus areas of the district. And you can see here, these are the priority areas set by building. So number 1, you see strengthened systems. So that's that whole building system, the infrastructure, the leadership, the communication. How are we functioning as a building, and how can we improve that? And then the next one was enhance universal classroom practices. So how are we supporting all of our students every day in our classrooms? So that really helps us as a district leadership team to identify professional development that we can provide for staff, and also helps us to know how to support individual buildings. So kind of from that comprehensive standpoint, but also individually throughout the year.
Thank you. As I move to the next slide, and before I have Laura share a little bit on this, one thing we've always talked about when we have that first PLC question in front of us, which is what do we want all students to know? I always talk to the staff about thinking of it having like an 1A and a 1B. So that's 1A. But 1B is, what's the best way to instruct that or get it to get it to the students? So that's the instructional component. What does that look like? What's that avenue? What do we know about research-based instructional practices? When you think about that, that really lends itself nicely to the work that we've been doing around the professional development this past year and what will be coming up in this next year. So, Laura, do you want to take the next slide?
Sure. So what we've done this past year was focus on cultural proficiency. Some of them had it already, and everyone did implicit bias for 5 years, right? So that was the foundation. But then we went into cultural proficiency at the beginning of the school year, and we met monthly for mandatory professional development district-wide, which is kind of tricky, right? Because Zoom, it's hard to be super engaging, but we did the best we could. And
Laura's being modest. She did a great job
It was
facilitating for
excellent.
the whole staff. She did outstanding. It was really good.
It was
So
scary.
good.
Yeah.
It worked out. Thank you all. And I partnered with Laura Daly on it because all of these things are intertwined, especially the social emotional piece, right? Like what they were just talking about. You might hear it a lot, but then not really understand what that is. And a lot of that has to do with self-regulation, right? Do we know when we're being triggered? And then how do we handle that? And that's so important for adults to know in order to build relationships so that students can be ready for rigor, right? So it's all intertwined. It all has to do with equity and, how we want the best, safe, welcome, and included experience for all our students. It's all married. And so we started there, and then we started to roll out culturally responsive teaching. And we've been letting Zarita Hammond's culturally responsive teaching in the brain kind of help guide us. And that's been really cool, but we're at the tip of it with the skill relationship building. So one of the things that we ended the year with was this idea of having them try to do selective vulnerability with some students or staff that they're trying to help build relationships with, because we want the adults to model it so that they, we want the principals to model it, the teachers, the teachers to model it with each other, and then they can then implement that with students, right? So that's kind of where we left there, and hopefully this upcoming school year will continue in that vein. We just have to figure out how. And we're going to roll out restorative justice in a more organized way. So what we did was we contacted Nancy Reisenberg from Minnesota, and if you've ever been on their department site, they're it's just really amazing. They also have some things that we don't have in place, which is they had an association that decided that it was going to be mandatory for all their teachers to get trained and keep being trained on a consistent basis. And so they had all this grant money to pour into them to be able to pay community members to help, support, and free people to help support. So it looks very different than what Iowa City has right now. But what Nancy said was really groundbreaking. She suggested that we focus on SEL. and we focus on social emotional, and we like go slow to go fast, right? And help and like make sure that adults understand what we're trying to do. So that when we do focus on students and try to help them, we're not then putting them back into environments where the adults don't understand what's going on and or might cause harm. So she recommended 3 consultants, and the one that we went to help us out was Becky McCannon. And so like we've been talking to her, and hopefully we'll be able to bring her on board officially. But she was at the district level. She taught, at some point, but she was really in a role to help roll out restorative justice in Minnesota in a strategic way. And so she's been doing some circles with some of our RJ team members, and with Laura Daly and Amy and I, to help like plot out what this could look like over 3 years, over 5 years. And it's not going to all happen at once, but we just know that there is such value in restorative practices and restorative circles, and how that's just, it just all will help with what we're trying to do to make things feel welcome, safe, and inclusive for all students.
Thank you, Brooke. All right. Next, we're going to segue then into the more intensive supports, and I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Glenn, and then I'll have her introduce her folks as she sees fit. Thank you. Okay.
For anyone who does already know me, I'm Ms. Glenn, Director of Special Education. So throughout this entire process of sorting out, all students in our system have access to those foundational supports, those universal supports, and then some students have access to some supports beyond that, and a few students have access to supports beyond that. And at any given time, different students could be at a different need for different resources in that kind of triangle that we were showing. But throughout the process of determining who needs what, sometimes a question is asked of, could this student possibly have a disability? And that is the child plan process. That's what in Iowa we refer to as child plan. And another way that it could be asked is a parent could ask the school to do an evaluation to determine whether or not their child has a disability. But I would say most often, somebody along the way at the school says, maybe this need for additional supports is because this student has a disability and that's why they need more supports. And so sometimes we end up determining that a student actually is entitled for special education and is in need of additional services, not just temporarily, but probably more in a durable fashion, longer term, not just a little extra help. Special education is not a little extra help. These are for these services are for students with disabilities who are in need of special education, specifically. So the rest of the presentation is kind of going to be, I'm going to go over, services for specifically who are targeted for students who are entitled. And I think another distinction is that students who are entitled not only have access to special services, they also have special rights and protections. That is equally as important, maybe even more important. Students, as soon as we ask the question, could they have a disability and be in need of special education, actually even at that point, a student has extra rights and protections. Protections against certain kinds of discipline, certain amounts of discipline. There are a lot of protective factors that kick in. So, for students who have need intensive supports, being entitled is a protective factor because those rights then kick in for that student. So I just, want to make sure that all of our staff, that people are never discouraged from asking that question when they feel that it is appropriate. So I always want to mention that.
Lisa, I don't want to totally derail what you're doing here, but I just got a question on the point that somebody's like, maybe we need to look into this and see if the student may have a disability and is entitled to actually being identified and going through the whole process. Could you give me a rough estimate of what that timeline is like? Because that's some of the stuff I've heard in the past is that that's really lengthy at times.
60 days.
Is that
60 days.
average? Is that just what it is?
That is
or-
the timeline. That is a hard and fast
Okay, thank you.
timeline. I mean, it could be shorter than that, but that's the outside of the timeline.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you're around with me for more than 5 minutes or so, you'll hear me say FAPE. So everything that we do is relative to FAPE, free appropriate public education in special education. That's what we provide. That's what we really provide to all students, but so IEPs are written relative to services that allow us to provide FAPE to students, and that's what the IEP includes. But I think sometimes, we talk about the IEP team, and FAPE. Probably so much, in my case, it's probably so much, that it seems to maybe go kind of right over people's heads and possibly gets maybe minimized in the process. It's probably because of my overuse. But the IEP process and the multidisciplinary team's role in crafting and overseeing that IEP in the process is the secret sauce. I mean, this is the key. It means everything and is worth everything. And certainly relative to the provision of SEDH and all other services for students with disabilities who are entitled. All of that stuff that you saw in that triangle, all of that's a given. Everyone has access to that. This is for stuff beyond that. Those resources, most of that, except that little tippy top part of that red in that triangle, anyone could have access to that if needed. These services are things that only this student needs and gets. And it's a result of their disability. They have to have it in order to access FAPE. It's based on high levels of information that we have about the student. A whole bunch of experts around the table that have an expertise from a different lens. And a lot of teamwork that says this is the right package. So the FAPE package, again, this is another thing that I like to talk about because an IEP should be seen as a package. It's not a service or a place. It is a very carefully crafted web of services, a package. And it's engineered, and literally I would say when you think about something being engineered, it really is that carefully constructed and should be by the multidisciplinary team, and that is the oversight committee of that student's provision of FAPE. It has to include some required members who are all experts from a different lens, including the parent or guardian and the student to the extent possible. That is critical, and sometimes that is where it becomes really hard for us to figure out how to solicit input from a student who may have maybe a student who has some difficulty with communication or is very young, but we want to and have to listen to our students about their preferences, their perception of their own strengths, what they would like to do in the long run with their life, all kinds of information that we can get from our students. And use that information and honor them and their voice in the process, along with the input of their parents or guardian. Includes all necessary services necessary for the access of FAPE, including SEDH. any part of that, social, emotional, behavioral health, and specifies the conditions necessary for access and for progress. That's what FAPE is, access and progress, and certainly is individualized. So some examples, and I mean, I could spend the rest of the night and all day tomorrow on examples, and I promise I won't. But I just put a few in here. I also think when I say individualized, people think, yep, yes, I get it, it's individualized. Probably not, unless you've seen some of our teams in action, and that's one reason why we have the pleasure of having Jamie Klein here and Brandy to talk about Ben, one of our star students, and to talk about the team process and the kinds of results that it has produced for Ben, and the magic of the secret sauce of the IEP team, and how individualized that process can be, and the kinds of interventions that it can produce, and the kinds of progress it can produce when it works the way it's supposed to, and how we think that we're just this is where the magic happens, and we're just getting better and better at it. So when we talk about the FAPE examples, again, we can go on and on about it. You can read through them, but the extent to which we can do any of those things, progress monitoring, and especially if you go down, Amy, I want to hit some of the resources. The level of resources that are available to our students who are entitled are very different than the level of resources available to all other students. So this means that all that stuff in that triangle, yes, all of that, and much, much, much more. So that doesn't mean that they don't need that stuff that you guys were talking about. Yes, they do. They need all of that. And all of what Laura was saying about, and you probably heard some common themes between Corinne, Lindsay, Laura. I'll say it. We all say it because we're speaking a common language now, which is something I'm really excited about, because our students experience that common language, that safe, supportive, relationship-based, caring environment, inclusive. You'll hear all of us saying those words, because that's what we're trying to achieve. That is a culture that we're setting up for our students. And it's a result of this SEVH work across the entire system. You can't do that work in a vacuum. And if you're trying by only putting an intervention model in place, that's what students experience, is that isolation type feeling. So all of those resources and many more. So I'm going to turn it over to Brandy Moon, one of our behavior specialists, lead teachers, and Jamie Klein, who has agreed, and she is Ben's mother, and they are going to talk about Ben tonight.
So we have many students that make some amazing progress and come from diverse backgrounds, abilities, ages, races, all kinds of things. We felt that Ben's case that we've been working on is very recent, and it also shows a wide range of the things that Lisa's talked about, and so we'll dive into it. Ben is an amazing kid. He is friendly, he is engaging, he is a very quick learner. He is everything. Handsome boy. He, young man, I should say. He's about to be 18. He, I could go on forever about how engaging and what a joy he is to work with. However, tonight in our presentation, a lot of our job is to talk to you about what happens when kids have more challenges. And so, although I could talk forever about those things, we're going to talk a lot about his challenges. Not to say that that's the thing that overwhelms him as a person. With that, the first thing is his list of diagnoses that he's had in the past. And along with being it's been my experience that some of the coolest people also have had to go through a lot of challenges to become that way. And so when I think of Ben, I think that is one of the things that is special about him. So he's had all of these diagnoses, and he came to us from Arizona. He attended Roseland Elementary Schools for his early elementary years, and then switched over to an Arizona Autism Charter School for middle school, which is a separate school for students with the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. And also, I forgot to mention that with Jamie being here, we've invited her to just pop in and mention anything that she'd like to throughout. So definitely just jump in or interrupt me. Then in 2019-2020 school year, Ben's family moved to Iowa City, and we got to have the opportunity to work with him here in our district. And he made some progress that year, but then in the fall of 2020, the school team was noticing that he was having some increases in challenging behavior, and that some of Ben's challenging behaviors include self-injury, aggression, destruction. And so they requested the challenging behavior team's assistance with figuring out kind of that secret sauce that Lisa mentioned for Ben. And whenever we are thinking that we are going to bring in some outside team members to collect data and help work with the student, we want to consider a reevaluation as part of the IEP process. So the IEP team met, determined that a reevaluation was necessary, and our team started our work with Ben and his teacher and staff team.
Can I interject right
Yes,
there?
please.
Ben was having the worst time of his entire life. COVID really, really is hard on special ed kids. I do want to say thank you so much for letting him go back in September, but he was off pretty much from March until September. And when I say he's having the worst time, enjoying himself, enjoying with others, putting holes in the walls at home. I mean, he needed so much help, and the school district stepped up like you wouldn't believe. And that list of the team, we had almost all of that, and that's what prompted this. But I mean, we were at wit's end, and that's what the picture of he hurt himself so badly that he almost gave himself a concussion. We had to take him to the ER. We had to, we needed to protect Ben from himself, from others, from the teachers, from the students. But that's what came to him when school came back after COVID. And so, the picture, I just see the blood coming down his face, and that's what they're having to help. And that's why, how successful he was is where he came from to what we're showing you right now. And so that picture is really important. So I'm sorry. That's all right.
Please.
It was just it's hard to convey how bad it was and how much better he's doing now. So.
When we do that, we do a lot of the things, or all the things that Lisa talked about earlier. We're interviewing staff and family. We're talking to just different professionals that we'll talk about a little bit later. Gathering information through observations, seeing what Ben enjoys and what the good parts of his day are, and how can we incorporate the things that he really loves in order to make his school day the most engaging for him and the most enjoyable for him. Along with that, this was a really lucky opportunity to be able to collaborate with the CDD out of the University Hospital, because Jamie and her husband had talked with them about seeing Ben for day treatment. And so Dr. Matt O'Brien and his team have a relationship with our challenging behavior team, because we've done a lot of the same work over the past several years. And so we are able to collaborate with him and his team whenever students go to day treatment and have assessments and interventions done there. And so this doesn't only mean that the people making the plans and things are talking with the people at day treatment. This means we're providing resources to the school so that members of that school team, paraprofessionals and teachers involved in working with Ben are able to join the appointments at the CDD, kind of learn and understand what the team there is finding out about what's the best way for Ben to work and learn. And they're also being able to participate in the appointments and the sessions where they're developing some interventions that are helping Ben learn. And they're getting trained by the staff at the CDD in some of those interventions. And so all of that coordination is happening. Jake Vitens, who I'll mention again later, was the lead challenge and behavior team member on this case. And so he is coordinating a lot with Matt O'Brien and going to a lot of those appointments with Jamie and Sean and with the staff from Liberty. In addition to that, we implemented what's called an intervention analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying that we are taking all of this data and all these things that we're learning about Ben and putting them into some possible ways that we can see putting into place for him to be successful at school. And then we're taking data on it and we're observing it and we're making sure that these things are working for Ben. Before we meet as an IEP team to decide that it's the right plan, we want to make sure we have that secret sauce right. We want to make sure that we have all those correct ingredients there. So throughout the reevaluation period, how that looks is that we are engaging in some very intensive problem solving, as Lisa mentioned. Our team is there present with the school team, and this is, I'm talking about mainly when Ben comes back from day treatment, so he's there for his full days. We're able to start implementing parts of that intervention that we're feeling like it, all of that data from all of those different sources came together to provide. And so we're meeting every day, and then as the intervention goes on, we can move out week to week. The collaboration with a large team of professionals, we want as many people with expertise in different areas as possible, providing input into the things that we're doing. We don't want to just come to it with our lens and our experience. We want to make sure that there's diverse experiences and expertise around the table so that they can all provide input and make sure that we're not leaving anything out. So we're making sure that academics are on point. We're making sure that we're talking about functional communication and growing his, he's already very, very quick at using his communication device, but making sure that we're continuing to enrich him and build those skills even further. And then just that constant monitoring and analysis of data. So the moment to moment is we implement part of the intervention and say he does a work task. We're watching that work task and making sure, okay, maybe that didn't go so well. What can we change for the next work task that comes up to prevent maybe that self-injury that occurred during that time or something like that? And then those people getting those things ready to implement that the next time and seeing if it goes better. Day to day, looking at the pattern over the day, where there's certain times that were harder, where there's certain environments that are harder, what paraprofessionals seem to have different strengths when working with Ben. And then week to week, looking at those patterns. We're just looking at pattern upon pattern to see what we need to make sure is included. So after we implemented that intervention analysis, we are getting to a point where we found a plan that we can see through data has been really successful for Ben. And he's learning and he's growing and that problem behavior is going down. And so we meet with the IEP team and we propose that plan. This is the plan that we found. Here are the, or maybe not the plan, but here are the different components that have helped Ben be successful. Let's decide on the best ways to include them in the IEP, the best instruction, the amount of time, all of those things from all of the different providers and experts that are there, along with Jamie's expertise on her son and what works best for him and what things he needs included in his day to really enjoy and want to come to school. We're collaborating with the instructional design strategist to make sure that we've got the right academic instruction involved, because we know that behavior and academics are so closely tied together. We want to make sure that that's the right mix. And then our team and our behavior interventionists that work as part of our team are there to train and coach the team throughout each school day. So we're not just saying, okay, here are the components that we think are necessary in this plan. See you later. Good luck. We are making sure that we are there every day coaching the team in interventions maybe they haven't had experience with before, coaching them in that same data collection so that they're able to continue. And they're building their capacity as time goes forward to be independent at running the plan and serving them independently. And that leads to a lot of teacher growth and staff growth over time, where there might be other students that then come to that teacher or that school that might have some of the same issues. They're able to then already know that intervention and be able to serve other students that way as well. So Amy's going to bring up here a list of people that were integral to Ben's progress this year and will continue to be. Kim Cranston was his special education teacher, and I asked her if there was anything she'd like to include in tonight's presentation. She just talked about it being such a great support to her and how much she loves and is proud of Ben. And she has learned so much, and she's just, if you know her at all, she's very passionate about her work and her students that she works with, and just loves them. Tim Kronk, we wanted to give a special shout out to because he was a general education teacher that really collaborated very closely with the team. Jamie was just showing me videos that he sent her on a daily basis, and that was one of the environments outside of a special education classroom that we were able to have Ben grow in his success in and include general education peers, doing his PE routine with him and things like that. Emily Deeney, Grantwood AEA autism consultant. She's also a BCBA, really important member of the team. Again, Jake Vitens, the challenge and behavior team lead team member on Ben's plan. And then all of the paras, I can't tell you how positive they were, and this is hard work. I haven't even gone into the nitty gritty of the interventions that were used and the detail at which we write the things that they need to do. But they came to work every day, ready to go again. And again, Ben makes it easy. Every person that walks into the room just walks out loving him and thinking he's the best kid. So.
But that's also a reflection of his team, because I always say he is so hard because I have known him his whole life, and every single one of them, because I worry because he's done things like grab them or, physical things that have hurt them. And I'm like, how do you still love him so much? And they're like, we do. He's funny. He's like engaging. And they love him. Like, I don't ever have to worry about him not wanting to go to school. And when we were talking about this, he uses a device to speak. So he's all summer long, even though he does ESY, he's like, bus, 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 and because the bus takes him to school. and she does mention this. But, we were coming from the situation.
Wanting to go when he didn't really have
school. We were gone, or I was gone with my daughter at a dive meet, and my husband sends me this picture because he will bring the lunchbox, and then he puts the backpack on, and then he goes up and he's like, I want to go to school. And he's not going to school, but again, the growth, like, we're almost 180 degrees where he was in December. But then you back up to where he was at the Arizona Autism Charter School, and that had a specific function. But when we would drive to school, you take an exit to go to the school, and he would point to keep going down the highway. But he did not want to go there. And, that's how Ben communicates. You have to read him. You have to see what he's telling you. And what he's telling me is he did not want to go to school there. He was not happy whatever they were doing. I mean, there were some questionable practices. And what he tells me now is like, I only want to be at school. Like, I want to be with these amazing people who go out of their way as hard as he is, they still are there. And, you know, it just, I can't thank them enough. And after every single meeting, I always say we're so lucky because they protect him, they teach him, they learn things to be better for him, and they love it. So we're just, I always feel so appreciative of those many, many people on that list. We're just lucky.
Well, my last thing is that we are lucky that you brought that to us, and that you guys have been such strong advocates and experts on your son. That collaboration from families is invaluable. It's that collaboration. I've seen people get to it. I'm like, okay, I have to keep presenting. So yeah, it's those conversations with families are so important. It's one of my soapboxes that I will try not to get on right now. But it's just, that's, I guess, I don't know, I think you said where the magic happens. And I think that is when all of the school people come together and then the family comes together with that. It's really great. So we have a couple graphs, kind of our not as exciting way to show you data, but also exciting to me. So hopefully some people in here are data people that like to see graphs. Percentage of his day engaged in problem behavior. This is just from October, and you can see there that high points are reaching almost half the day, or 75% of the day, engaging in his identified target behaviors that we are trying to reduce. And from January 15th on is where that graph really starts to change to, I don't know if that would be 3%, 5%, something like that. So.
And the reality of that is there were times that Ben would engage in behaviors for an hour and a half. And that would be an hour and a half of grabbing other people, slamming his own head in the wall, and that's just one episode of an hour and a half. And then you look at, I get, Kim's so proud. She texts, she's like, no behaviors all week. I mean, the difference of an hour and a half in a single day to nothing over the course of an entire week, I mean, it's just phenomenal. I mean, I go back to how lucky, because it was really scary. Like, I know the numbers.
This is frequency of behavior episodes per hour. So an episode would be, when she said, an hour and a half. And not that every one of these is an hour and a half, but just the frequency count and how that goes down. And again, you won't see that they're all zero here. But combined with the last graph, it shows you that those episodes are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And that when they do pop up a bit, that's when that team gets together, because we're already getting together regularly. But that's when we're talking and saying, okay, what do we think caused that spike in behavior? And sometimes that's due to, we just extended a little bit of the expectation there that he's learning. One of the things that he did and throughout this time is that he went from having an exemption from wearing a mask or a shield to, and he may still have the exemption, but he has increased mask wearing and putting it on himself and being able to wear it for a more extended amount of time, being able to recognize due to cues on his work system, which work systems are the ones where he's expected to put on the mask while he's working. So some of those new expectations that we put into place might be reasons for spike in behavior. It might be due to other things too. But we are having those regular meetings where we're able to come back and say, okay, now what do we do to prevent this, or how do we support this new skill in a way that he's not engaging in self-injury? We are here tonight because, partly because I believe some concern about seclusion and restraint. And so, like I've heard Lisa say a lot of times, and we all say, we want each student to get to a place where they're at zero. We want each student to be at zero restraints and seclusions. We have to help them or protect them, like she said, if they are trying to injure themselves or something like that. But with the intervention and with all that team getting together and with us really looking at the way school works best for Ben, we are able to see that he is having 6 and 9 incidents of restraint in December and January, down to 0 in March, 2 in April, and then May and June, none. So we also continue to look at that data and make sure that we're not getting into situations where he is stressed enough that something unsafe begins to happen, and also looking at ways that we can structure his day where, he's more comfortable at school, or, things like that. Some other.
I was gonna say, I just think restraint, it's got such bad connotations when I think about how Ben has been helped, because he really was, if they restrained him, it was because he was going to do harm to himself or others. It wasn't that, and there are so many people that are making sure he is not injured and protected. So it's a tough word to hear, but that's not how I hear it. I hear it as, oh, thank God he didn't get to hit his head on the floor again. And I wonder how many of the restraints for the district-wide numbers were all Ben's. Because, he was just so, again, this is back to where he was in October, November, December. But thank God for them, because I don't know what could have happened to him. Brick walls and a forehead. So I see it that way, and I know they're so careful, and the teachers and paras and everyone is so careful with him. So I hate that word.
Well, you reminded me of our conversation the other day when we were reviewing slides together. She was talking about one of the reports that she got, and I think it's important to point out that when you see restraint numbers, and when you might see photos of restraints that look pretty concerning, that is probably not likely that those are what's in the numbers that you're seeing. Because as Jamie brought up to me the other day, she said, I got a report for a restraint that it sounds like they were just holding his arm.
And so we get 301 reports, and I'll tell you, in January I got 6, and you have a meeting after a certain number of, after a certain number of 301 reports, and I kept getting them. I'm like, oh my gosh, another one. And the next meeting was for the 7th report, and we didn't have that meeting until April. So he was doing, and what struck me, and I was glad they told me, because it's like an open door policy, a blue sky policy, whatever you want to call it, but that meeting was over the fact that they either grabbed his elbow like this for 10 seconds or his shoulder. And so, to guide him, because he had started to get frustrated in PE because he has demands, and with wonderful Coach Kronk, and they did this instead of this, and I was like, we're having a meeting over that. I'm like, how do I feel about that? And the beauty is, they told me what it was, and they told me how minimal it was, but yet they're quantifying that as a restraint. I was like, well, thank you for telling me, and yay. That's it.
Our teams are, they're not always just touching an elbow. But the definition, what I told her the other day, was the definition of restraint is that you're restricting someone's movement. That's the definition in the law, where they're not able to move at free will. And so if he was going to hit someone, or whatever was going to happen, or do something to himself, and someone grabbed his arm to where he could not move it of his own volition, then we read it up as a report, because that was a time that he wasn't able to move on his own. And so, it was just a funny
And
conversation.
because this is not a numbers game.
Right. Well, that's what I was
It's
just
not a
thinking,
numbers
Lisa.
game.
I think
We want
part of
people to
the,
know.
part of the intent in telling you Ben's story tonight, right, is to personalize that experience, not only because it's a great story, it's a good example, it's a success story of that, but you don't just see the numbers move from over 1,500 to 69 without that intense process that they walked you through about all of those steps that take place, right? Where you see actually change in behavior and change in response from the staff to elicit the change in behavior from the student. And so I think that's part of the picture that we wanted to try to draw too, is what is that process behind the scenes to see the improvement over time with that. We talked about some contributing factors, at the last meeting, but having, I think, a personal example to say what actually happens when we have students that are experiencing this and what are all of the steps we've put in place to try to address that, all the way from core to what everybody gets, like Lisa talked about, they get that and more, and what does the and more look like, and what are all of those things in between when we do have actually success occur and success take place. So I know I kind of interjected there and you're still wanting to share some progress and celebrations, but thank you for sharing, Ben, with us, and I think it is something that, everybody's proud of in that instance, and there's, of course, rough patches along the way to get there, but I think it just speaks to the gravity of when you hear Brandy talk through all of those team supports and all those people surrounded around a situation to try to address it. It doesn't happen by accident. Those numbers just don't change. They are people, and it is people working with them to see that movement. So, go ahead, sorry.
No, thank you for mentioning that. It is people. When we see those numbers, that's, we might see a 40 here, 60 there, whatever. But, we know each one of those kids and their faces, and that's, just thank you for mentioning it. It's a good reminder. Some other things that are really amazing about Ben's progress this year that can't be represented in a graph. He's generalizing skills across environments and different staff members. He has several paraprofessionals that rotate in and out throughout his day, and he's able to perform his work tasks and things with all of them. He's generalizing those skills when he goes to PE and when he comes back to the classroom in the hallway, getting lunch. He's now successfully completing multiple sessions of independent work. So a lot of times you may have in the past seen Ben working directly with a teacher, directly talking and teaching with Ben every moment of the day when he was involved in academic work. Whereas now we're working on building that independence at the same time, where the teacher's able to give him a work system where he knows what to do and he does his work and they can kind of sit back. That independence for kids is so vital because that is another step in the direction to being more inclusive and being able to reach those core goals. He's able to wear his mask, I said before. He is learning lots of new leisure skills that he'll be able to use now and beyond. And practicing those, playing little bowling games in the classroom and different things. He has had reduced para support on the bus. He's making progress towards understanding different ways to have his wants and needs met in different ways. There's different interactions that he likes to have with the staff around him. He can be very loud during those interactions, and so that wasn't a priority at first, but as our work with Ben has continued, he's able to now take cues of when to use a lower voice tone and when to use a louder voice tone, and that again helps him generalize outside of the classroom in different community environments or in other parts of the school. He's developing relationships with peers without IEPs through the PALS program at Liberty, where different students come in and spend time with him both in his classroom and, as I said before, in PE at times. He's extended his time and the number of activities that he engages in during PE, and he's moving, again, that was this picture, from wanting to request the bus to go home to wanting to request to come to school. Before, when he would be at school, when he was having his really hard time, he would go over and point to the bus all the time. He wanted to leave. And now he's wanting to come, so that's great to hear.
It's been telling you you did a good job.
He's doing great.
Thank you. God.
I just want to say, first of all, before I go on, I know several people have said it around the table, but I really, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank our staff, both Ben's team at Liberty, the entire team at Liberty is Ben's team, the whole building. Because one of the things that Jimmy mentioned to me, and I think I mentioned it to the principals because I thought it was so revealing, is that you said that just the culture at Liberty was accepting. You felt like that was part of that secret sauce that has led to, his improvement and, his success there is that you, your family, him, the whole thing has just been kind of set up for that inclusive wrapping around him. You didn't say that part, but that's what I perceived from what you said.
It's building his community, because we had that when we were at a non-autism only schools. Almost all of them had engaged peers, and like you knew that if you went out in public and those people were there, they would come up and talk to him. Where you don't have that in an autism only, because socially they generally don't do that. But like we're building that community back up so that, it teaches typical peers to be good people. Yeah. And so he's going to have that support as well, because he's going to need it. And he has it. Like I always, McKenna Schroeder, like she's my favorite little angel. My girls go there, but I can't exclude them. But she asked to spend more time with Ben. Like, I don't think this time is enough. And I'm like, this is amazing. And because they've done these things, like I don't have to worry. Like it's a little bit less of a worry that there's more eyes on him. There's friends and people care about him. And if you don't have, and it comes from Justin down, because like Emily O'Donnell will say, "Oh, it's Ben's posse. Ben's posse's walking around with all the resources." Yeah. But it's that having that community is so important, and like again, it's been fostered at Liberty that he didn't have. So kudos.
Yeah.
Again.
So that safe, supportive, inclusive environment that we build from the foundation up. PBIS for all improving adults, and goes with that relationship-based work that we're doing across the whole district. And Liberty actually is one of the secondary buildings that was ahead of the game and actually really doing some of that PBIS work first. I think that's really evident there in what we've seen. But just all of our staff across the whole district who work tirelessly with our students that have a lot of needs. I just want to personally thank them. And this is not easy work. Being a teacher at all isn't, or a para, or a social worker, or I could just name on and on and on the different roles of people in our district who have taken really good care of our students, all of our students. But of course, especially for me, our students with IEPs who have a lot of needs. And some of these people are coming to work every day and doing really difficult jobs. And I just really appreciate that. And I know their families do. I know they have to. I know they do. So I just really feel that I want them to hear that again and again and again because they deserve it. So, back to the beginning of why are we even talking about this? We are committed to ensuring that all students are welcome in our schools. All students are welcome in our schools. All of our students are welcome. We're not going to tell any students that their needs are too great. It's up to us to harness our resources, get our teams around it, get our resources and our minds around it, and innovate that secret sauce and figure out the solutions. We are doing that. We are doing that in every case. In every case, we are doing it. We know that some students have disabilities for which they are in need of extensive support. And we accept every single one of those kids as they are. exactly as they come to us. We accept them just as they are, and we work with what they bring. Because we have a lot of answers, and we have a lot of people who are amazing, and we get them around. And they're committed. You know, we have a lot of really committed people, and they're doing that work. And they're working with the families, figure out these solutions, and using their resources. We will employ protective measures, whatever is necessary to ensure the safety for everyone until those right solutions are in place. Just like we talked about with Ben. We're not going to let Ben crack his head open. We're not going to just stand back and say, I'm sorry, we're not going to physically manage you then. That would be ridiculous, completely unacceptable. And our plan, you know, if our plan were just to continue to restrain Ben over and over and over and over and over and not get that team together, that would also be completely ridiculous. But until we get plans in place, you know, when we have some of our students, we have from 3 to 21, and all students from 3 to 21 are going to have natural ups and downs as they go through everything that all students go through. You know, they have natural ups and downs in their lives, and so we'll see those numbers go up and down sometimes. Sometimes it's just nature, growth, hormones, all kinds of things. If Ben has a pain somewhere, he can't tell you that.
No.
What if he needs a root canal? He can't tell you that. So sometimes it takes a little while to figure out what is going on with a lot of different students that we have. And until we figure out the secrets, what's making them tick, what's going on here, we have to keep people safe. And if we ever didn't have the ability to keep people safe, the reality is we wouldn't be able to have some of our students at school. We're not willing to say that. We're not willing to say we're inclusive and equitable, except you. You can't come. You're not welcome here. No. No, that is not good enough. Who is it going to be? Who are we going to say that to? We will never achieve equity if we're willing to say that to anyone. We won't have an equitable environment. So the goal in every single student case is to reduce the number of restraints or seclusions to 0. We've done it in Ben's case. We've done it in many cases. And that is always the goal. We have checks and balances in place at the IEP team level, at the building level with those monthly reviews, regular reviews of all of the incidents in every single building, every single month. Also with the implementation checks, every single BIP in the district has a monthly implementation check, so that we can make sure the plans are actually implemented, we're doing what we say we are doing. Then we have the district review on top of the building review every single month. Then we have state reporting now that we didn't have before. There's oversight at the state level and also with all discipline actually now. And those determinations are actually public facing too. We're reporting to the school board now yearly, so there's multiple levels of accountability of checks and balances, which we want to have. The school board report annually, we're getting to the place, I'm happy to say, where if we may or may not be able to break information down to a certain point because it may be identifiable. I'm happy to say that because I'm excited that our numbers are that low, that we're worried about breaking our numbers down further. So, you know, of course we can't give out information that is identifiable risk.
Lisa, I'm sorry, quick question about that. Is that why we do it annually to the school board? Because if we do it more frequently, it may be identifiable for the kiddos?
It's highly likely.
Okay.
There are some thresholds that have been determined by the Department of Education to be threshold at which, you know, a data set would be lead to the ability to identify a student. We don't determine that, but
Okay.
So we have and we want checks and balances. When you see that information, it's just important to know what you're seeing. You're seeing that graph, you're seeing all those ups and downs for any student that we have in the district. Every student that we have in the district. We have students in the district who haven't previously been served in public schools successfully. I know of several cases where that is true. And we are serving those particular students successfully, very successfully right now. We have students who live in group homes because they are no longer able to reside in their own previous homes. We have students whose parents open enrolled them because they were not happy with the service they were getting in their resident district. If any of those students are physically managed, all of those numbers stay right here in the district. That's not always true with achievement scores. Sometimes achievement scores go back to a resident district. Restraint seclusion stays here. So even with all of that's what we're seeing in those numbers. If they're here, they're ours. So what questions do you have at this point?
So Lisa, I'm going to go through math. That's what I'm supposed to do for the money. So Matt,
That's all right.
So this is an illuminating presentation tonight. And one thing it illuminates to me, I'm thinking of right now, is I didn't do anything as a board member to have any of this happen. So can you talk to us as a board, if other board members want to hear this, what can we do to continue this work and to make it go in the directions that we talked about before? Or should we just do what we have been doing in the past? And other board members have been much more involved in making the changes or making the decisions that allowed this to occur.
Yeah. Like I said before, I think part of what we wanted to show you is the depth of this work. But really, one thing you can keep doing is supporting Lisa in her work. Like, she came to us at a really rough time in special education in Iowa City. And again, I would just say this didn't happen by accident, right? I mean, she put these systems and structures in place. And so there's a lot of credit that needs to be shared, and she did a nice job of doing that and talking about the professionals on the ground and doing that. But leadership makes a difference in this area. And I do think Lisa deserves a tremendous amount of credit for the systems and structures she's put in place to facilitate this level of work. And so I do think that's one thing we need to do is recognize that didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen by accident. There was a lot of intentionality and just even the building out of teams, talking about a challenging behavior team to come in and do that. And so I think supporting that is one thing. I do think asking those questions, Ruthina's question is a good one. Can we see that data on a more regular basis? Lisa said we want checks and balances. We want to hold ourselves accountable to be looking at that. We don't have any problem showing that data unless it becomes something where it infringes on somebody else's rights to do so, right? So if we want to talk about, the frequency of that report out and when we're able to do it, those are good questions to ask. But I think part of the picture we're just trying to paint and draw together tonight is all of the steps that then inform that last outcome measure. And I think that's what we should do, whether it's seclusion restraint data, that's when it's academic outcomes, what are all the steps that take us to get to that point? Because it's really easy to look at that last point and make judgments or perspective on that. But you guys with the front row seat of that, I think we wanted to make sure had, some good information about the work behind the scenes going to inform that. So I don't know if that greatly answers your question, Charlie, but I do think when we talk about how we grow capacity and commitment to serving our kids, those are the things we need to think about is we do need the structures and systems to support the work to do to really be able to provide that intense support. And we're not perfect. We have a ways to go, in different buildings with different students and different challenges. The front end of this SEL curriculum is brand new for us. We are going to need support to continuing that and commitment to doing that. And, Laura Daly's going to need the same thing or to do the same work that Lisa did about building out the structures in special ed that we'll have to do over here in learning support. So I don't know if that satisfies your question or not, but those are a few of the things that come to mind right away.
I jump in there a little bit, Charlie. I think one of the things that we talked about after a meeting a while back was that we all have to own it, right? We have to keep it front of mind. We have to keep the conversation alive so that we don't get complacent in anything. And I think that's true when we talk about our special education program, any of our equity solutions, anything that we're doing. As board members, we have to make sure that everyone knows that it is a priority for us and for our district so that we can have these conversations and always kind of look forward, right, how to move that forward. So I think that's our job, is to make sure that we're not forgetting about it and then ignoring it and then we don't talk about it. Because it's great to celebrate successes, right, but somewhere along the lines there will be a pitfall, and if we got complacent about it and we're not talking about it, that's a barrier that maybe is not getting addressed. So I think that really is our duty, is to make sure that we are staying with success stories because we're on top of it, right? So I think that's what we can do to help.
One thing I heard tonight so far, that Ben's story was not, it's not a complete success story from when he started in the district to where he is now. It's,
He's never going to be a complete success story. He doesn't, like, it's always going to be, because behavior is his communication. So when he does something, he's trying to tell us something. And he has learned that if I engage in this behavior of grabbing or hurting myself, you're going to try to figure out what I'm telling you. And that's a lifelong thing. So like right now, he's struggling. I call them blips now, but I can't tell you, we've spent years of having to deal with this. We had holes in the, like, my husband finally repaired the holes in the wall because, and there's not damage right now. I mean, so now it's blips, and it's always trying to figure out what are you trying to tell us, and teaching him a different way to tell us instead of engaging in aggressive behavior. But I mean, I always like to explain that he's 17, he's 6'3", so he's significantly bigger than most women. Everybody there, actually. And, he's got hormones going through him, but he functions at a 3 to 4 year old level that can't talk. So, I see this as a success. I also think we're going to have some moments where he's struggling again. And to be honest, he is right now because he can't go to school. And he's so upset about not being there. And he's doing ESY, and they're doing the best they can in the 2.5 hours he gets to go. But he wants to be there. And so when he can't, what does he do? He tells us, and he tells us by engaging in behavior. So it is a success. I mean, it really is a success overall the course of like the last 6-7 years, because we've been dealing with this for a long time. And to have some peace at home, and I know school is playing a huge role, because it was like, it's scary sometimes when he gets that upset and you can't calm him down. But we haven't seen that in so long, like at least not being, huge engaged. But it is a success.
And I think it depends on how you define success. I think we could have presented a student that at the end was going to 5 general education classes a day and, you engaging in core coursework and all these things at the end. But if we weren't continuing to make growth with that student, no matter where they were, then that's not a success either. I think I've been in this district for 14 years now, and I've seen at different times I'm kind of a blunt person, so I'm just at different times, when we didn't know as much, before we went through some learning, that there may have been a mentality among different individuals. I don't think I ever felt this way about the district as well. But among different individuals, that some kids are just going to be hard. And some kids are just going to need restraint and seclusion. I don't think, at least, I don't come across that mentality anymore. And that, like what Lisa said before about it would be unacceptable to continue having those restraints on that graph, is completely true. That's unacceptable. That's not a success, even if it's 2 restraints a month. And that's part of that checks and balances point that she was talking about, is that when we're reviewing that data, we are looking to see, are there students that have had continuous restraints and or seclusions over time? And if they have, no, even if they're less than what Ben was having, that's not okay. We're reaching out to that team and that principal to say, hey, what can we do? What support can we provide? Who can we meet with? You know, what problem solving is happening at the building? Because we may very well reach out to that building and they are doing some problem solving on their own. So I think the success part is that we are continuing to make growth and we're not stopping. We're not giving up on anybody. We're not saying that there are kids that are just going to be hard or just going to need restraint and seclusion. That's not an option for us. There will always be something else we can do to get that number down.
We know that Ben has lifelong disabilities. We know that. And we know that he may encounter times of difficulty. So we know that we're not going to staff him out of special education, or we're not going to say he's not going to have access to these people anymore. We're going to have these people waiting in the wings, even when they don't need to be there every day. Because we know that there could be a time when he'll encounter, maybe he'll need a root canal again, or whatever, you know, whatever difficulty he might encounter and isn't able to tell us in a different way, or whatever the case may be. Or even just growing, becoming a teenager for another student. All students go through times where they have their ups and downs. So we should predict that for students who have disabilities too. That doesn't mean we just accept, oh, well, you know, they're going to need some restraints. No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying it could happen and we need a response to get
That's exactly
right on
it. It's
it.
the brainstorming, like, okay, we had to do this, and the brainstorming how not to have that happen again. And so, like, to figure out, because I always say Ben is mercurial. He figures out, you'll figure out one way what the works, and he's like, I'm switching. And so, like, and it might be a spike, and then they go, okay, so how do we bring that back down? And it's that brainstorming and that teamwork that let's not have that happen again. And that's what's pretty amazing, because he is probably going to need it. He'll need it again. He may need it this summer still. But yet, and they're telling me, but they're like, well, let's figure out how to solve this before. I mean, and that's the thing. Let's solve it before we have to get there. But if we do, we're definitely got to figure out how this doesn't happen again.
But something Brandy said can be even transformative beyond this issue, right? That when she was talking about the belief almost about this is just the way it's always going to be. Like, think about that with other, issues we've talked about in the district, right? Here's a success story where we took what maybe people thought was always just going to be part of the equation and transformed behavior, transformed their thinking around it, and ultimately their beliefs around what was possible. And I think, it sounds good to say we believe we can do something different, but here's an example to point to that is actually tangible for people to say, yes, it can be different, because I think that's really what we have to dig into when we talk about other areas of the district where we have to have transformative changes. Okay, we need to show some progress to be able to get that belief, right? Sometimes you change behaviors before you change beliefs, and I think that's what you started to see happen here in the special ed lens, is we had to start changing our practices and our behaviors, and wow, what kind of beliefs changed beyond that once we see those results.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story, and Ben's story. It's, we need that. I kind of live at the tip of that triangle in my professional life, but most folks don't. Certainly most folks in the community don't. So I think it's really important for us to put a story and a face to, and a 6'3" body to this work that we're doing. And Lisa, I think when I sat down with you, when you first got hired, you told me, that you didn't come to this district despite the challenges, but you came here to fix it. Because of the challenges. And you talk about belief, there's nothing stronger than belief when it's there. And now I believe you, right? And I did believe you then, because you're very convincing. But because this is a culture shift. I was in the district too for 10 years when we didn't have these beliefs. And when a lot of kids were just like, well, they're just going to be in the trailer out back, or they're just going to be restrained or whatever. And that's it. That's the level. We plateaued and we're fine because we have all these other successful kids, and we'll pin our hat on that and we'll brag about that left and right. But this other stuff we'll just sort of ignore, and that came to a very public light. And that was when a lot of us campaigned right at that time, and that was a really, really hot issue. And to see this transformation, I mean, the data was one thing, and it was a little unbelievable to go from 1,500 to 69. But now it's believable. Now I know why, because there is a culture shift. And you're right, Matt, if we can do that here, we can do that in all of the other areas that we want to touch on. You know, we can get there with the leadership that's going to set a standard, provide the resources, which is what I think we can continue to do, is provide those resources so the good folks can do the work and show folks it can be done. And let's get, and then we, this kind of presentation lets me know, we might be able to move the needle on reading scores and math scores, which are a national thing that very few people have figured out. But I believe if we have this approach with RJ, restorative justice, cultural proficiency, we're going to get there. And I'm really excited that you sharing that story makes that come alive for us so that we can get off with our data and our numbers and say, here's a story, and here's a clear demonstration of a culture shift. Whether this is what PBIS can look like in a secondary building for that tip of the triangle, and other data we've seen out of that school with how that's affected the broader population. So I just really appreciate you guys bringing this to us, Matt, for having these folks put this together so we can see this, and that we can continue to support you folks doing all this great work. So thank you.
Yeah, I have to agree. Seeing some of the changes with our special education program and hearing your family story gives me hope that procedures that we put in place there and the collaboration that I see between Lisa and Amy, that we can continue to make those changes needed with our procedures for problem behaviors and discipline. So I think Lisa probably just made Amy's job a little bit harder, because now it's like we're seeing changes here, so we're going to keep coming a little bit more probably aggressive, at least me, but you love my aggressiveness and wanting to see that change, especially when it comes to the disproportionality for our Black and brown students and our students with disabilities as it relates to the discipline. So I appreciate hearing Ben's story, and we do have to celebrate the successes, because they're successes. I mean, it will never completely change. I grew up in a family with a brother with autism and schizophrenia, so I saw some of those behaviors, and I wish he went to a school district that implemented the changes, because it took a very long time before he can live a life that we see as being a success. And he's 4 years older than me. I'm not going to say how old I am, but that gives you a range. So, if he would have had interventions as early as Ben is getting, I think he could have had a different life story than what we're seeing now. But it's still a good story. It just didn't happen in the educational environment that we're seeing here. So we have to keep putting in that work so we can see more families celebrate the successes that impact their life after they leave us.
I think that some schools talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk.
Absolutely.
And I've seen that, like at his last school, where I would bring these experts in and say, this is what we need to do to be, like, help stop this. And we'd have the meeting, and then nothing would happen.
Yes.
And they wouldn't do what we knew would help him. And here, they did the research, they talked with us, they did all these things, and then implementation. And that's, I think Ben could have been that kid where, you just get him through. Mm-hmm. And they didn't do that. They haven't done that. And I fully believe they won't. But they also had faith that they were going to, we're going to figure, and that's the thing with when he was at his highest, there was another kid who was like Ben, and they're like, and look at him now. Because I've been in school, so I would actually see him. They're like, Ben was, so they had faith that they could make the change. And so it's not just Ben's, there's another kid there that had these struggles. And so they knew they could do it too, because steps had already been taken, they've been doing some of these things, and it's just, he's lucky though. Again, I go back to implementation's key.
We do it all the time. Not we, but our teachers. I don't do anything. They do everything. I don't directly serve anybody. They're the magicians.
But you
They
created
do
the
it all the
culture,
time.
but you helped create the culture and the vision and the drive around true equity. And reflecting like JP, when we were running, this was one of the very hottest topics, and you have, with lots of supports throughout the district, changed the culture. And I'm impressed with your commitment for so many years, sticking with some of the harder times in the district, and now being part of this rejuvenation of the culture, and how wonderfully excited you are to talk about Ben. And thank you for sharing your son's story today and helping us see the personal change that what Lisa's team and the entire district is doing for you personally. It was very powerful, and I want to thank you for just sharing with us. And then the final thing that blew me away the most, maybe not the most, but added to being blown away, is Ben's posse. And so, because that's bigger culture change. That's helping students appreciate diversity and acknowledge and welcome and share and be friends, and that'll go out into the world. This is part of bigger change, what you're doing here in our district. So
And
thank you.
the willingness for them to do that, because, I was scared, to be honest. Like, I was scared that he would hurt another student. And so I'd be like, can we just leave him back in this? Seriously, I wanted to keep him back. And they're like, well, we take him. He's got like his posse with him, and then, they sit with him. And if he struggles, because he does sometimes, he doesn't want to be there, or he wants something that they say no to, and so they take him out. But it's there, and and they engage with other kids, and it's really, but yeah, that's Emily. Emily's like Ben's posse.
And you mentioned the culture and the structures and kind of what people can do to keep them going. And I just think in the 14 years that the district in the past few years has made such a priority out of SCBH, and because we had these skills before, but the priority wasn't as prioritized, and the things that these administrators have done to prioritize the social, emotional, mental health of students has allowed us to make these changes with students and teachers. Without those structures, without that culture of not giving up, I could say, back when I was, a Strat 2 BD teacher in my own room, and it was kind of like, take care of it, I could say I'm not giving up all I want. But until that structure is there, until those resources are there, until the expectation is there that we're not giving up as a district, then that stays there, and that the results aren't as good.
So that kind of goes, I'm going to bring it down a little bit, right? But, we've had people with the story of, I'm advocating for my child and I'm giving you information from experts and nobody's listening to me, right? So we've had those stories here. So I'm trying to frame this in, why were we terrible, right? Because we weren't, right? But how do we ensure that, as we try and change a culture, that is really hard, right? It's pushing the boulder up a hill. How do we identify where we have little gaps and folks aren't feeling like they're part of the team all the time? Because we have a great story here, wonderful success, which we have every day in our district with lots of students. But I think you're the first one to say that if there's one that's not having a good time, we're missing something. So how are we making sure that the processes and everything around it is so robust that as we make this culture shift, it is going to be sustained? Or what have we learned over the 14 years of here's where we failed all the time and here's what we did now, or what we're doing now that is addressing that? Like, what are we learning from that stuff?
I'll take
You know
that.
what I mean?
You're right, I am the person to say that. That we're not where we want to be. We have a lot of success, and I'm super proud of the work. I'm really proud of the work our staff is doing, but we're not hitting the mark every time. Our students are complicated. They're always going to be complicated. The work is super hard. It's always going to be hard. It should be seen as a continuous improvement cycle. We're never going to be where we really want to be. So therefore, we have to have an ongoing set of checks and balances, and just a process for looking back and reevaluating where are we now, and regular processes for determining that. So we have those at the case level. That's the IEP team that oversees that. We have that at the building level also, with the PLCs in the building. First and foremost, the gen ed PLCs, who own all kids. And then also we have on that, top of that, special ed PLCs. On top of that, we have building IDS who assist with those PLCs. And on top of that, we have special ed IDS who assist with that whole process too. And on top of that, we have our lead teachers who also meet with those PLCs. So it's layer after layer after layer to ensure those checks and balances are going on. But within the individual process of the IEP teams, I think that is probably a bigger concern at this point. How do we pick off like individual students who are not making progress and nobody has sent up the red flag about that? That's what we're working on right now, getting kind of a better screening process for that. So that really kind of accelerated with the pandemic because, there are just a lot of kids kind of in that boat right now just as a result of the pandemic. So we're thinking it out of what to do right now as an extra process. And we're always working on something.
Sean, I'd like to add to that as well, and you might have been thinking specifically to special education, but I was thinking, larger back to gen ed as well. And I would just take you back 3 or 4 years when Susie was in her health services role and wanted to step back. And as Matt and I were contemplating, what to do in that role, we really looked at having 2 particular needs, and that was around helping to support our English language learners, because we had grown to about 1,500 students at that time. We were as big of a population there, or even larger than in our special education population, and really had curriculum coordinators overseeing that role. So that was a piece we were thinking about, and also the PBIS piece, or the lack of general oversight around behavior or social emotional learning, behavioral health, social emotional learning supports. And so when we looked at that, we added the director position of learning supports department. So again, that position's only been around about 3 years. I remember first coming to the district, and we'd have a couple of individuals working Crean, and others would just try to pull us in and talk to us about behavior, but we really didn't have anyone in that leadership role. And so I think shoring it up on that side, we have a lot of work to still do on the general education side to really bring to life completely what we've described in pages 6 through 16 of that publication. But it goes hand in hand. And so when we can provide for the students at their initial level, then we're not going to have kids. If we're doing good with the core, we're not going to have to serve as many kids in intervention. And when we're not doing that, they're not slipping into the need of having tier 3 supports, and then they're not slipping into the need for entitlement. Some of our kids are always going to come to us and have the need, and much like your son, he would have shown up for us. But there's other students that, in putting all these other supports in place, might not be entitled someday, because if we can have a really good, robust system over here. So
Right.
those are
We
the
sort
pieces
of-
I would add.
14,000 plus students, 2,000 employees. So our job always has to be systems and structures for those people, and that's what we have to hold the line to. And then, like you said, Sean, when we get examples of where it goes wrong, of course we need to have cases of how do we deal with that too, and how do we individualize that experience. But really, as a district, what our focus has to be is always on those system structures, processes, procedures, and then what are our checks and balances, just like Lisa talked about, to hold people accountable to those behaviors, right, to that work that we want them doing. You know, the other thing all the time in education is we try to do all of these things, and you've probably heard me say before, we have to figure out the things that matter most. We can't spend time on things that have low impact. It has to be the high impact. And those systems and structures then have to be centered around what are those high impact strategies, and that's where we have to spend our time and make sure our folks are spending their time. So I think, you know, it's no easy answer, but I think that's the conversation in that cyclical continuous improvement cycle Lisa's talking about that we have to keep coming back to. Are we adhering to those high impact, high leverage strategies that are making a difference for our students? And when we're not, that's probably when we're seeing results that we're not happy with.
I would totally echo what JP said, that it's belief, right? And I think from top level, and you know, to Charlie's question, you know, what do we do as board members? I think I'm going to speak for everybody and tell you that I believe that we can keep moving forward and be successful here. And I think that's an important thing from top down, that we have to share that belief, but we also have to recognize that there's work to do and figure out what we can do to help that. And you know, the adage, the proof is in the pudding, right? People are going to be more inclined to believe if they start to see the successes. But for an individual whose student is not seeing success right now, it's hard to see that bigger picture, right? They're very focused on, you know, their situation and their student, and they're struggling, right?
Yep.
So that's what their concern is, and you know, so we have to make sure that we're doing everything we can to, you know, support that student and that family, and you know, that shared belief that we can do it, I think is the important step. I think that's kind of our role as a board, is to say that we do believe in the process, and I do appreciate all the great work that's been done.
Actually, that IEP process is always most valuable to individuals. That's a good thing, especially if there is always that process, always. That is the only process that can be used to make changes for an individual anyway. We can't have any one-size-fits-all solutions, and I can't come out and say, this is now our approach to SCPH, and this is what we're going to do for everyone. I can say that, but that's not going to be the case. We have no power to do that. The IEP determines for individuals what those individual solutions are going to be anyway. That's always the driver, that multidisciplinary team. So that is what the answer should be. Go back through that IEP team. Request a meeting, can be in that team, and all parents and guardians have safeguarded in that process.
I'll look around, see if anybody wants to jump in with anything else.
I'll just go back to the high and say that I am so proud of the district and the work that you've all put in. I was afraid to say anything because I did not want to be emotional. I really tried, but sorry. But anyway, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I know that we are not there yet, but we're making strides, and so it's important that we celebrate the little victories that we have along the way. So thank you all.
Anything else from the team to wrap up?
We just thought we'd come back strong tonight, first night in person. So, full force, Sean.
I just want to thank everybody that prepped for the presentation and delivered.
My thanks for everyone coming out.
Yeah.
And sharing. I appreciate it. With that, it is late, so for my directors, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.